Derek Johnson had always loved the quiet of the woods. From the time he was a little boy, he found peace in the sound of leaves rustling, the smell of pine after the rain, and the soft crunch of twigs beneath his boots. Growing up in a small town in North Carolina, his father had taught him how to read the land, how to follow deer trails, and how to respect nature. Hunting wasn't just something Derek did for sport, it was part of who he was. It gave him patience, focus, and a connection to the earth that nothing else ever could. When Derek finally bought his own home at 42, he thought life had come full circle. The property wasn't huge, but it was enough for him, a cozy two-story house tucked inside a quiet suburban neighborhood surrounded by trees. Behind his backyard stretched acres of forest, hills, and creeks where he could walk for hours without seeing another soul. Best of all, there was a well-known stretch of public land nearby where hunting was perfectly legal. For Derek, it felt like the perfect balance, modern living on one side, untouched nature on the other. At first, life in the neighborhood was peaceful. Derek kept to himself most of the time, but he was polite whenever he crossed paths with neighbors. He'd wave to joggers in the morning, stop to chat with elderly couples walking their dogs, and occasionally trade gardening tips with the woman next door. Everyone seemed friendly enough, and he assumed they were glad to have a quiet, respectful neighbor like him. On weekends, Derek would head out before dawn, dressed in his camouflage gear and carrying his carefully maintained hunting rifle. He'd park at the small gravel lot near the edge of the public land, sling his gear over his shoulder, and disappear into the misty woods. Those early hours were his favorite, when the world was still and silent, except for the distant hoot of an owl or the gentle bubbling of a creek. He never hunted recklessly, he always followed every safety rule, respected the wildlife, and cleaned up after himself. Everything seemed perfect until the first letter arrived. It was an official-looking envelope from the Homeowners Association, neatly stamped with their logo. Inside was a short, formal notice: Derek had been fined $1,200 for unauthorized hunting activities. At first, he thought it was a mistake. He wasn't hunting on anyone's private property, and he certainly wasn't breaking any laws. The land he used was open to the public and had designated hunting seasons. Confused, Derek decided to attend the next HOA meeting to clear things up. When the day came, he walked into the small clubhouse where the meeting was being held. Inside, several members sat behind a long table stacked with paperwork. A few other homeowners filled the seats around the room. Derek politely explained that he hunted only on state-approved land, well outside of the neighborhood's boundaries, and that his activities were completely legal. But instead of understanding, he was met with cold stares. One of the board members leaned forward and said, "We've had complaints. People have seen you leaving early in the morning with a rifle. It makes families uncomfortable. This is a family community, Mr. Johnson. We want a safe environment." Derek tried to reason with them. He explained that he never discharged his weapon anywhere near the neighborhood and that his hunting grounds were miles away. But the board wouldn't listen. Another member chimed in, "It's not just about safety, it's about the image of our community. Hunting doesn't fit with the kind of environment we're trying to create here." It was the first time Derek felt out of place in his own neighborhood. The next few weeks were tense. He paid close attention to the rules, double-checking every hunting regulation, making sure he was in full compliance with the law. But despite following everything to the letter, more letters from the HOA followed, each one sterner than the last. They accused him of endangering residents, scaring hikers, and disrupting community harmony. Derek began to notice the subtle shifts around him. Some neighbors stopped waving when he passed by. Others whispered as he walked his dog. It wasn't everyone, a few still treated him kindly, but the air had changed. For the first time since moving there, he felt like an outsider. Despite the tension, Derek refused to give up the one thing that gave him peace. Hunting was more than a pastime, it was how he recharged after long weeks at work. So he kept going, careful and quiet, determined not to let the HOA's warnings push him away from something he loved. Still, he couldn't shake the growing frustration. He wasn't breaking any rules. He wasn't trespassing. He wasn't putting anyone in danger. And yet, the HOA seemed determined to make him feel unwelcome. Then came the incident that changed everything. One Saturday morning, Derek was returning from a long hike through the woods, carrying his gear, when he noticed two HOA board members standing near the edge of the neighborhood trail entrance. As he approached, one of them snapped, "You really should find a different hobby." The other muttered something about bad influence under their breath. Derek didn't reply. He simply walked past them, but the words stuck. That night, sitting on his porch, Derek began thinking about how much control the HOA seemed to believe they had over everyone's lives. It wasn't just him. Over the months, he'd heard other residents complain about strict lawn regulations, parking fines, and endless rules about home decorations. It felt like the HOA wanted to manage every detail of people's lives, including what they did outside the neighborhood. Derek started researching his rights, poring over local property maps, hunting laws, and public land boundaries. He wanted to understand exactly where he stood legally. And in the middle of all that research, he stumbled upon something unexpected. He discovered that the popular hiking trails the HOA bragged about in their community brochures, the ones families used every weekend, weren't actually part of the HOA property at all. They were on privately owned land. Even more surprising, that land had recently been listed for sale. At first, Derek thought nothing of it. But the idea lingered in his mind like a spark waiting to catch fire. The HOA had spent months sending him letters, fines, and threats, all while assuming they controlled the woods around the neighborhood. But they didn't. For the first time since moving there, Derek felt like the balance of power might shift. He didn't act right away. He kept the discovery to himself, quietly returning to his routines while continuing his research. He spoke to a local real estate agent, double-checked the property boundaries, and confirmed everything. The land, all 40 acres of it, was available for purchase. Derek leaned back in his chair, staring at the map on his laptop. The very same trails the HOA promoted as a selling point for their nature-friendly community could, in theory, belong to him. The thought made him smile for the first time in weeks. He didn't know it yet, but this small discovery was about to set off a chain of events that would change the entire neighborhood forever. The tension between Derek and the HOA grew slowly, like a quiet storm building over the horizon. At first, Derek thought things would settle down after his polite explanation at the meeting. He believed once the board members understood he was hunting legally, they'd leave him alone. But that didn't happen. Instead, the letters kept coming. Every few weeks, a fresh envelope appeared in his mailbox, the same HOA logo stamped in bold letters across the top, the same cold, formal tone inside. Each notice accused him of something slightly different. One claimed his hunting created safety concerns for the community. Another suggested his presence near the hiking trails was intimidating to families. The fines kept stacking up, each one more frustrating than the last. At first, Derek tried ignoring them. After all, he wasn't breaking any laws, and he knew the HOA didn't have authority over land they didn't own. But ignoring the letters didn't make the problem go away. The HOA's persistence started to seep into other parts of his life. Neighbors who once waved warmly now glanced away when he passed. The kids who used to pet his dog on their evening walks no longer came near his yard. Even casual chats about the weather or lawn care became strained, as though people were nervous about taking sides. Derek wasn't sure if the HOA had spoken to everyone or if people were just uncomfortable with the tension, but either way, the atmosphere around him began to shift. Despite all of this, Derek continued his weekend routines. Hunting and hiking were his escape from stress, his connection to the natural world. He had grown up walking through forests, respecting the wildlife, and understanding the balance of nature. For him, those quiet mornings among the trees were sacred. No letter, no fine, No whispered complaint was going to take that away from him. Then came a Saturday morning that made everything worse. Derek returned from an early trip into the woods, tired but satisfied after hours of hiking through the misty trails. As he approached the neighborhood, he noticed 3 HOA board members standing near the entrance to the walking path, talking in hushed tones. The moment they saw him, the conversation stopped. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and an authoritative posture, stepped forward and said, "Mr. Johnson, we've told you before. This is a family-friendly community. People don't feel comfortable seeing you leaving so early with all that gear." Derek paused, trying to keep his tone calm. "I'm not breaking any laws," he said simply. "The land I use is open to the public. I'm always careful, always safe." Another board member, a woman with a clipboard tucked under her arm, shook her head. "That may be, but perception matters. Families move here because of the peaceful environment. You showing up in camouflage with equipment isn't exactly comforting to them." Derek nodded slowly, resisting the urge to argue. He could feel their stares following him as he walked away. That encounter stuck with him for days. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they looked at him like he didn't belong, like his very presence was a problem to solve. Over the following weeks, Derek noticed the HOA stepping up its efforts. Flyers appeared in mailboxes about community safety. New signs were posted near the hiking trails reminding residents of neighborhood rules. And the letters kept arriving, each one written in slightly sterner language than the last. For Derek, it became less about hunting and more about principle. It wasn't just that they were trying to stop him from doing something perfectly legal, it was the way they assumed control over everything around them. The HOA wanted power over more than just lawns, fences, and driveways. They wanted to dictate how people lived, even beyond their property lines. One evening, sitting at his kitchen table, Derek spread out all the letters he'd received from the HOA. There were 8 in total now, neatly stacked in a row. He read through each one carefully, noting the language, the fines, and the accusations. They talked about community safety, harmonious living, and preserving neighborhood values. But to Derek, all it felt like was pressure to give up something he loved, to conform to rules that didn't even apply to him. And that's when he remembered the property maps he had found while researching hunting regulations. He opened his laptop and pulled up the bookmarked files. There it was again, the 40-acre stretch of wooded land the HOA proudly featured in its brochures and on its website as a selling point for potential home buyers. He zoomed in on the boundaries and smiled quietly to himself. The land wasn't HOA property. It wasn't public property, either. It was privately owned and still listed for sale. Derek leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. The very same trails the HOA used to attract new homeowners, the same trails they claimed to protect with their endless rules, weren't actually theirs at all. For the next few days, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He imagined the board members holding their meetings, speaking in confident tones about their land and their community features, completely unaware of how vulnerable their position really was. It was tempting, more than tempting, to make a move. Still, Derek didn't rush. He wanted to be sure. He contacted a local real estate agent under the radar, asking quiet questions about the property. How long had it been on the market? Were there any offers pending? Could an individual buyer make a private purchase? The agent confirmed everything: the land was available, the price was reasonable, and the current owner was eager to sell. Derek's heart pounded as he considered his options. Purchasing the land would be a big step financially, emotionally, and strategically. But it would also give him something the HOA couldn't take away: control. If he owned the trails, the HOA couldn't fine him for using them. They couldn't dictate his presence there. In fact, they wouldn't even be able to promote the land as part of the community anymore unless he allowed it. The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. It wasn't just about hunting anymore. It was about standing up for himself in a way that was entirely legal, entirely fair, and entirely within his rights. But Derek also knew he had to be careful. If the HOA found out what he was planning, they might try to interfere or rally the community against him. So, he kept his intentions quiet. He didn't tell his neighbors, didn't mention it at work, didn't even bring it up in casual conversations. Instead, he began working quietly behind the scenes. He reviewed loan options, spoke discreetly to his bank, and got pre-approval for financing. Each step made the possibility feel more real, more within reach. One evening, as he signed the initial paperwork with the real estate agent, Derek felt a wave of calm wash over him. He wasn't doing this out of spite, he reminded himself. He was doing it to protect his peace, the very peace that had drawn him to the neighborhood in the first place. Weeks passed, and Derek kept up his routines as though nothing had changed. He continued receiving letters from the HOA, each one filed neatly into a drawer he no longer bothered opening. Neighbors still whispered, and the board members still stared when they saw him. But behind the scenes, the ground beneath the HOA's confidence was slowly shifting, and they didn't even know it. Every walk through the woods felt different now. He looked at the winding trails, the wooden bridges over small creeks, the open clearings where families had picnicked for years and knew they were about to belong to him. It gave him a quiet sense of power, not the kind that shouts or boasts, but the kind that simply waits and watches. Derek had spent months defending himself against accusations, rules, and fines. Now, he was preparing to take a step that would change everything. And while the HOA thought they were winning, the truth was, the real game hadn't even begun. The decision wasn't easy, but once Derek made up his mind, there was no turning back. After weeks of quiet planning, late-night research, and careful discussions with his bank, the moment finally arrived. Derek signed the last set of papers with a steady hand. It was official, the entire 40-acre stretch of forest, the same land the HOA proudly promoted as part of their community charm, now belonged to him. It felt surreal at first. He stared at the documents spread across his kitchen table, each one stamped and sealed, proving he was the rightful owner. All those winding trails, wooden bridges, and quiet clearings that had drawn families for weekend walks were now under his control. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, Derek felt like the balance of power had shifted quietly, completely, and without a single confrontation. But he didn't celebrate. Not yet. Derek was careful, and he knew timing was everything. The HOA didn't know anything about the purchase, and he intended to keep it that way until the right moment. In the weeks that followed, Derek went about his life as if nothing had changed. He still woke up early on weekends, still headed into the woods for hunting or hiking, and still came home to the same quiet street lined with neatly trimmed lawns. To the neighbors and the HOA board, it was business as usual. But Derek walked those trails with a different feeling now, a sense of quiet ownership, a calm confidence he'd never had before. When he crossed the wooden bridge over the creek, he smiled to himself, knowing he had the legal right to decide who could step foot there. When he passed the little picnic clearing where families gathered, he thought about the fact that every inch of it was now his responsibility. He wasn't motivated by revenge. Derek didn't want to hurt anyone or cause unnecessary trouble. What he wanted was simple: respect. For months, the HOA had tried to control his life, to pressure him into giving up something he loved, even though he wasn't breaking a single rule. Now, without raising his voice or sending a single angry email, he had put himself in a position they couldn't ignore. Then came the day of the next HOA meeting. Derek didn't normally attend unless absolutely necessary, but this time, he arrived early. The small clubhouse was buzzing with activity, residents chatting about upcoming events, board members shuffling papers, and volunteers setting up chairs. He found a seat near the back and waited patiently as the meeting began. The board ran through their usual agenda: lawn care reminders, upcoming community projects, and, of course, a brief mention of ongoing safety concerns regarding hunting in nearby woods. Derek almost smiled at that part but kept his expression neutral. When the floor opened for community comments, Derek raised his hand. The room grew quiet as he stood up, holding a neatly folded set of papers. He walked calmly to the front of the room and addressed the board in a steady voice. "I've listened to your concerns over the past several months," he began. "I've read every letter, every fine, and every rule you've sent my way. And I've done my research. I want to make something clear: the land where I hunt has always been legal for public use. But things have changed recently because now, that land belongs to me." He placed the papers on the table in front of the board members. "As of last month, I am the owner of the entire 40-acre property, including all the trails, bridges, and clearings you've been using as part of the community's recreational space." For a moment, silence filled the room. The board members glanced at each other, flipping through the documents with wide eyes. A few residents leaned forward in their seats, whispering among themselves. Finally, the silver-haired board member cleared his throat. "You own the land?" "Yes," Derek replied simply. "Every inch of it? And as the owner, I have full authority to decide how it's used." Another board member tried to regain control of the moment. "Mr. Johnson, this community has relied on those trails for years. Families use them daily. Surely you don't intend to restrict access?" Derek paused before answering. "I haven't made any final decisions yet. But given the way I've been treated, the letters, the fines, the accusations, I think it's time I set some boundaries of my own." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some residents looked worried, while others glanced at the board with frustration. Derek calmly gathered his papers, nodded politely, and walked back to his seat. That night, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Word spread quickly that Derek now owned the land the HOA had been advertising as a community feature. Some residents came up to him in private, expressing their support and quietly admitting they had grown frustrated with the HOA's strict rules. Others kept their distance, unsure of what would happen next. The following week, Derek took the first official step. He sent out notices to the HOA and the homeowners, informing them that all hiking and recreational activities on the property were suspended until further notice. It wasn't a permanent closure, not yet, but it was enough to make a point. The HOA called an emergency meeting the very next day. Derek didn't attend, but he could imagine the chaos unfolding inside the clubhouse. The board had built their entire image around promoting the neighborhood as a nature-friendly community, using photos of those trails to attract new buyers. Now, without access to the land, they couldn't deliver on that promise. Days later, Derek began receiving emails from the HOA, but these were different from the stern, formal letters he'd received before. The tone was softer, almost pleading. They asked if he'd be willing to negotiate, perhaps allow residents continued access in exchange for a small maintenance fee. Derek thought about it carefully. Part of him wanted to agree. After all, he had no desire to punish the families who enjoyed the trails. But another part of him remembered every fine, every cold look, every dismissive word at those meetings. He remembered how they tried to make him feel small, as though his rights didn't matter. For now, he didn't reply. Meanwhile, the neighborhood felt the impact almost immediately. Parents had to cancel weekend walks, runners complained about losing their favorite routes, and real estate agents quietly stopped promoting the trails in their listings. Rumors began circulating that property values might drop if access wasn't restored. Through it all, Derek stayed calm. He continued living his life as he always had, going to work, caring for his home, and enjoying peaceful weekends in the woods he now owned. But beneath the surface, he knew things had changed permanently. He wasn't the quiet, overlooked neighbor anymore. He was the person who had quietly reshaped the balance of the entire community. And for the first time, the HOA realized they couldn't control him, not his hobbies, not his land, and certainly not his freedom. Still, Derek didn't gloat. He didn't boast or wave his ownership papers around. Instead, He chose patience. He wanted the board to understand something more important than rules and fines: respect. Because sometimes, the quietest moves make the loudest statements. And this move, buying the land they thought they owned, had spoken louder than any argument ever could. But deep down, Derek knew this was only the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to give up easily. There would be more discussions, more proposals, maybe even legal attempts to challenge his decision. He smiled as he walked through the forest one morning, the early sun streaming through the leaves. The trails were silent now, no footsteps on the dirt, no voices echoing between the trees. For the first time, it was exactly the way he liked it: peaceful, calm, and completely his. Derek knew he had the upper hand. And this time, he intended to keep it. The silence in the woods was something Derek had come to treasure. Since sending the notices suspending public access to the 40-acre property, the trails had grown quieter than ever. No footsteps crunching on the dirt paths, no laughter of children playing near the creek, no distant chatter from hikers. The peace he once sought was finally his. But with that peace came an undercurrent of tension rippling through the neighborhood. At first, Derek ignored the stir his decision had caused. He went about his life as though nothing had changed, waking early to sip coffee on his porch, taking his dog for evening walks, and spending weekends wandering through his land. But the HOA wasn't quiet for long. Within days of the closure, Derek received a letter, not a fine this time, but an invitation. The HOA wanted to discuss a solution that benefits everyone. The tone was softer, friendlier than the previous letters, but Derek had learned to read between the lines. This wasn't an invitation, it was an attempt to regain control. Derek debated whether to go, but ultimately decided to attend. He wanted to hear what they had to say. The next evening, he walked into the community clubhouse. The atmosphere was different from any meeting he'd attended before. The board members sat straighter, their voices quieter, and there was no hint of the sharp, dismissive tone they had used months ago. A few residents were there too, their faces filled with curiosity and, in some cases, frustration. The silver-haired board member, the same one who had once scolded Derek at the trail entrance, cleared his throat and began. "Mr. Johnson, we appreciate your time tonight. We understand you're the rightful owner of the land adjoining our community, and we'd like to propose an arrangement." Derek folded his arms, saying nothing yet. The man continued, "The trails have been an important feature for the neighborhood. Families enjoy them, children play there, and the community's appeal depends on access to nature. We'd like to offer you a partnership. The HOA will maintain the trails, handle upkeep, and, in return, you'd allow residents continued access. Of course, we're willing to discuss compensation for your cooperation." Derek listened carefully. A few months ago, this offer might have sounded reasonable. But he hadn't forgotten the letters, the fines, and the countless ways the HOA had tried to control him. "I understand the trails are important to the community," Derek said finally, his voice steady. "But let me be clear, for months, I was treated like a problem instead of a neighbor. I was fined, warned, and accused of things I didn't do. Nobody wanted to listen when I explained myself. Now, you want to negotiate because it affects you." A quiet murmur ran through the room. The woman with the clipboard, another board member, leaned forward. "We admit mistakes were made, Mr. Johnson. Perhaps we were too strict in our approach. But think of the families. Think of the children who've grown up walking those trails. Closing them permanently it would hurt the community." Derek paused. He wasn't an unkind man, and deep down, he sympathized with the families who used the trails responsibly. But he also knew this wasn't just about residents enjoying nature, it was about power. The HOA wanted the land because they'd built their identity around it. Without access, their brochures, their promises, and their sense of control were all weakened. "I need time to think," Derek said simply, standing up. "I'll get back to you." He walked out without waiting for their response. In the days that followed, the pressure on Derek intensified. Flyers appeared in mailboxes urging community unity and cooperation. A petition began circulating, signed by dozens of residents asking him to reopen the trails. Some people stopped by his house, knocking on his door to politely plead their case. Derek listened to everyone, but he didn't make promises. Then came a different kind of pressure, subtle but unmistakable. He overheard conversations at the local grocery store about selfish decisions and neighbors who don't care about anyone but themselves. While most people were respectful to his face, he could feel the shift in how some residents viewed him. Through it all, Derek stayed calm. He walked his dog, tended to his garden, and spent quiet mornings wandering his land, thinking carefully about what to do next. He wasn't motivated by anger, but he wasn't willing to be bullied either. One Saturday morning, as Derek walked the trails, he stopped by the small wooden bridge overlooking the creek. The sun reflected off the rippling water, and a soft breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth. It was beautiful, peaceful, exactly why he loved this land. And in that stillness, he made his decision. The following Monday, Derek sent a formal notice to the HOA. All access to the property was permanently revoked. There would be no negotiations, no exceptions, no partnerships. The response was immediate. Within hours, he received multiple emails, some polite, others frustrated, all pleading for reconsideration. The HOA scheduled another emergency meeting and invited him to attend, but Derek declined. His decision was final. Soon after, no trespassing signs went up around the entrances to the trails. Wooden posts marked the boundaries, and Derek even installed small cameras at key access points to ensure the rules were followed. The neighborhood was divided. Some residents were furious, blaming the HOA for mishandling the situation and pushing Derek too far. Others blamed Derek for being stubborn and uncooperative. But there were also quiet voices, neighbors who slipped notes into his mailbox thanking him for standing up to the HOA's control. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled to find a solution. Without access to the trails, their brochures and website were outdated, their promises to home buyers incomplete. Calls from frustrated homeowners filled their voicemail boxes, and property listings began losing their nature trail access appeal. Behind closed doors, Derek knew they were struggling, but he didn't take pleasure in their difficulties. His choice wasn't about revenge, it was about drawing a line. For months, he had been treated unfairly, and now, for the first time, he had the power to decide what happened on his own land. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm. The trails remained empty, reclaimed by silence and the soft hum of nature. Without constant foot traffic, wildflowers began blooming in clearings, and birds returned to areas once crowded with hikers. Derek spent his weekends enjoying the land in ways he never could before. He built a small fire pit near the creek, set up a bench overlooking the hills, and carved out quiet spaces where he could sit and listen to the forest come alive. Sometimes, he thought about reopening the trails maybe someday, under different circumstances, with rules that respected both him and the land. But for now, the decision stood. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The HOA stopped sending letters. The whispers around the neighborhood quieted. People adapted. Without the trails, families found other parks, joggers discovered new routes, and life in the community went on. Derek had learned something valuable through it all, something the HOA had never understood. True respect isn't demanded through rules, fines, or authority. It's earned through understanding, fairness, and balance. He had spent months fighting for his right to enjoy the land peacefully, and now, he finally could. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Derek stood at the edge of his property, watching the light filter through the trees. The woods were quiet, except for the distant call of an owl. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, he felt truly at home. Months had passed since Derek closed off the trails, and the neighborhood had slowly adjusted to the change. What had once been a central feature of the community, the hiking paths, the wooden bridges, the quiet clearings where families gathered, now belonged entirely to him. Nature had begun reclaiming the land, covering the old paths with wildflowers, grass, and fallen leaves. Without constant footsteps and voices, the forest had grown quieter, more alive in its own natural rhythm. For Derek, life had settled into something simple and peaceful. He woke up early each morning, brewed his coffee, and stepped onto his back porch to watch the sun rise through the trees. The land felt different now, more personal, more connected to him. It wasn't just a place to hunt anymore, it was his sanctuary, his reminder that patience and quiet strength often win battles louder voices cannot. But outside his personal peace, the community was changing in ways no one had predicted. The HOA, once so confident and strict, now faced growing frustration from homeowners. Without access to the trails, many families felt misled. New buyers who came expecting exclusive nature paths were surprised to learn they no longer existed. Some residents demanded answers, and others wanted leadership changes. By the end of summer, several board members, including the silver-haired man who had once challenged Derek, stepped down from their positions. A new group of volunteers took their place, promising more transparency, fairness, and better communication with residents. Interestingly, Derek received a letter from the new HOA board shortly after they took office. Unlike the cold notices of the past, this one was warm and respectful. They acknowledged the mistakes made by the previous board and expressed hope for rebuilding trust in the neighborhood. They didn't ask him to reopen the trails, nor did they make demands. It was simply an apology and an invitation to a fresh start. Derek read the letter twice before folding it neatly and setting it aside. He appreciated the gesture, but for now, he wasn't ready to reopen anything. The land had become too important to him, not just as a place to escape, but as a symbol of standing his ground when no one else would. Still, as weeks turned into months, Derek noticed something subtle shifting among his neighbors. Where once there had been whispers and distance, there was now curiosity and, in some cases, quiet admiration. A few residents stopped him during his evening walks to chat, asking about his land or sharing stories about their own frustrations with the old HOA. One afternoon, as he worked in his garden, a young couple from down the street approached him. "Mr. Johnson," the husband said hesitantly, "we just wanted to say, we admire what you did. Most of us didn't agree with how the HOA handled things, but we didn't know how to speak up. You showed everyone that we don't have to accept unfair treatment." Derek smiled softly and thanked them. Moments like these reminded him why he had taken the stand he did, not out of anger, but out of principle. Despite the tension of the past, Derek never saw himself as someone who won or lost. For him, the entire experience had been a lesson in patience, resilience, and the importance of knowing your rights. The land itself became a reflection of that journey. Over time, Derek invested in maintaining it, not for the community but for its natural beauty. He built a small wooden bench near the creek where he could sit and listen to the water rushing over smooth stones. He planted native flowers along the edges of clearings, inviting butterflies and bees back to spaces once worn down by heavy foot traffic. Sometimes, he would walk deep into the woods, past where the old trails ended, and stand still, breathing in the scent of damp earth and pine. The peace he felt there was something no one could fine him for, argue against, or take away. It wasn't about ownership anymore, it was about balance. One crisp autumn evening, as Derek sat by the fire pit he'd built overlooking a small meadow, a few neighbors came by. They asked if they could join him, and he welcomed them warmly. They talked for hours, sharing stories about the neighborhood, laughing over old HOA rules that had once seemed so important but now felt distant. Eventually, one of the neighbors asked, "Do you ever think about reopening the trails?" Derek poked at the fire thoughtfully before replying. "Maybe someday," he said honestly. "But it has to be different next time. It has to be done with respect for the land, for me, and for everyone who enjoys it. No more rules that push people around. If it happens again, it'll be on terms we all agree on. The neighbors nodded, understanding his position. For the first time, Derek felt like he wasn't standing alone anymore. By the following spring, the neighborhood looked different. The new HOA board had softened many of the old restrictions, focusing less on control and more on collaboration. Residents were happier, more involved, and more open with one another. Derek still kept the trails closed, but there was no tension anymore, no angry letters or whispered conversations. Instead, there was quiet respect. People understood his decision now, even if they didn't all agree with it. For Derek, that understanding was enough. Life became calmer, and in that calm, he found room to reflect on everything that had happened. He thought about the first time he'd received a fine for doing something perfectly legal, about the countless nights he'd sat at his kitchen table reading letter after letter, and about the day he discovered the land was for sale. He thought about the moment he signed the papers and the first time he walked those trails knowing they belonged to him. Most of all, he thought about how much he'd grown through it all. What had started as a conflict over hunting had turned into something larger, a reminder that patience, quiet action, and standing up for yourself can create change without shouting or fighting. One sunny morning, Derek walked along the creek where wildflowers had bloomed in shades of yellow, white, and purple. The sunlight sparkled on the water, and a soft breeze carried the sound of birdsong through the trees. He thought about how far he'd come, how different things felt now compared to those tense early days. The land was peaceful. The neighborhood was calmer. And most importantly, Derek felt free. As he sat on his wooden bench, watching the forest come alive around him, he smiled to himself. He wasn't angry anymore, and he wasn't holding on to the past. The land had given him peace not just because he owned it, but because it reminded him of something bigger. True freedom isn't about control. It's about balance, respect, and knowing when to stand your ground. Derek had done that. Quietly. Patiently. And now, he could enjoy the life he had built, one where his choices were his own and where the forest behind his home stood as a silent testament to what happens when determination meets opportunity. The trails remained closed, but Derek wasn't closing doors forever. Someday, he might invite the neighborhood back in. Someday, families might walk those paths again. But if that day came, it would happen differently, with mutual respect, clear understanding, and shared appreciation for the land's beauty. For now, though, Derek was content. The woods were his sanctuary, the place where every decision, every challenge, and every lesson he had learned seemed to meet beneath the rustling leaves. He leaned back on the bench, closing his eyes as sunlight warmed his face. Somewhere in the distance, a deer moved softly through the trees, and the sound of the creek filled the quiet. For the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly as it should be.